Absolutely privileged to welcome you here this morning, this afternoon in Sydney, New South Wales. Thank you to Compassionate Communities Australia for putting this webinar on, for inviting me to open the space, but a massively warm welcome to Victoria from Life Rights. So you are in for a treat. I want to start by acknowledging country. So on behalf of us all, I pay respects to the traditional custodians of this collective land on which we gather today. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have lived on this land for tens of thousands of years and have a deep spiritual connection to the land and its natural resources. We acknowledge that in Indigenous culture, death, dying, and end-of-life care are considered significant stages in the cycle of life, and that the passing of a community member is seen as a time for mourning, reflection, and deep spiritual connection with their ancestors and the land. As a non-Indigenous person and on behalf of us all, we promise to approach these topics with respect, sensitivity, and a willingness to listen to and learn from our Indigenous community. And I extend my personal respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. So it is being recorded, as you well know. You're going to get an opportunity to put some questions in the chat, but also we're going to share the space just like a conversation in about 25 minutes where you'll get to speak. So make notes if you need to on the questions that you'd like to bring in. You are in for a real treat today. So I'm very, very proud to introduce Victoria to you all. Buckle up and sit back. I've known Victoria for a decade and I've always been deeply inspired by her unique perspective and skills on how we do death and how we can do death. Victoria is an established performance artist who some years ago made a conscious decision to reframe her artistic practice into what she calls contemporary rites of passage. Victoria pioneered the Life Rights model of integrated end-of-life care and after-death care. She is a holistic funeral director, a celebrant, an end-of-life doula, a counsellor, and I'm proud to call her my friend. Yes. She was one of the team that created the incredible Picnic Among Friends, which is a community memorial event that's been going on in Sydney for over a decade. You'll be hearing about that today, as well as two other amazing initiatives. And Victoria, I remember going to the Picnic Among Friends with my daughter, who was 10 years old at the time. He's now 18 doing her HSC. And I asked her this morning, like, do you remember going to that picnic? And she said, yes, I remember playing with like pebbles and sea glass and broken rocks and honouring our grandparents while we were there. So I'm so pleased that you get to share this with the world today on this webinar. And over to you, my friend.
Over to me. All right. Well, thank you for the very warm and beautiful welcome and introduction, Jessie, and also to Compassionate Communities for inviting me to come and share some of my work and passion with you all. Thank you, Julianne. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the banks of River Gulyari in the inner west of Sydney on Bidjigal land. And I also want to thank all of you for giving up your lunchtime to come and listen. So please feel free to eat your lunch or wherever you're coming from in Australia. So I'm going to begin really just by jumping straight in. And I'm going to share my screen because I've got a little death by PowerPoint for us all. And I'm going to talk through, in a way, I'm going to start with the picnic and I'm going to talk through some of the work that I have engaged with as a creative artist, a performer, but also an end-of-life and after-death care professional, and the way in which I've engaged creative participatory community practice to build up grief literacy and death literacy and to really initiate and continue conversations across community and to start to break down some of those barriers between where the arts begins and ends and community work begins and ends and professional practice begins and ends, and find all sorts of different ways of producing experiences and transmitting information and knowledge, and really practicing how we participate, how we watch, how we listen, and how we engage in all the experiences of life, with a particular focus on death, loss, remembrance. So I'm going to just share my screen with you. And okay, can everyone see this PowerPoint?
Yes, looks great, Vic.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to really frame this as speaking to creative ceremonial practice. And I'm going to talk through a few of the things and events that before I established the Life Rights model of care, or as I was establishing it, really, some of the work that began in the mid-2000s. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we do. And there's a few of the Life Rights team members here today, so thank you, and that's great to see you again today. The work that we do that runs alongside and wraps around our primary focus, which is the creation of very powerful end-of-life, after-death care and funeral rights. So along and around that, we run a creative and cultural program of events inside our funeral home. And there is a performance trio that has emerged really from our community ceremonial work, which I'll also talk to. But I'm going to focus primarily on the Living with Our Dead picnic and another series of community ceremonial events at Rookwood Necropolis called the Dusk Ceremonies at the Elephant House. So I'm just going to start. So I'm going to play a couple of videos, and I know some of you may get some dodgy sound, but this one that will play as a way of introduction only has sound at the end. And then I'm going to talk you through the elements of the picnic, because I really want to utilize this time to drop in to how we made the picnic among friends and what the grief duties of care and sort of practices were that underscored each of the elements. So in 2010, I was working as a end-of-life person and a celebrant, and I was also the recipient of an Australia Council for the Arts grant that was specifically designed for people who had left the frame of the arts, who had taken their practice beyond arts practice. And my intention was to be in residence at an independent funeral director for 6 months. And my other project for this grant was in the previous sort of 7 years in which I'd been building this integrating end-of-life and after-death care. When people were talking to me about what I did and I told them, I was always the recipient of either really bad funeral stories, but always this sense of, after the funeral and all of that's done, how deeply personal and individual and often isolated people were in their grieving. And so I really wanted to create an event that held community, a community memorial event that enabled people to enter in ways that they felt comfortable, given where they were up to with their grieving, whether it was recent or raw, or whether they were coming to remember people, the ancestors they'd never met. So this is what we're heading into now. I live in the inner west of Sydney, and this beautiful ceremonial little park is in my area, and this is where the first Living with Our Dead community picnic among friends. Living with Our Dead was the name of the community organisation that still exists. So I'm just going to begin with a few images. What I did was I engaged local artists to create little installations, and as people moved down into the picnic, and then really understanding the relationship between grief and loss and beauty and aesthetics, and how we could engage our senses when we were grieving. So just have a look at this and I'll unpack it fully. So So these are all the things people saw on the way down. Heading into the picnic space.
What do we grow from the spaces initially present to us as loss? In those transformative, unknown places lies infinite possibility of how we continue the relationships that connect us to those we love, to the lineages and histories that shape us, and through which we, in turn, shape our worlds.
So that's a little intro to the picnic. So the first invitation for people in the language that we put out in the months before this picnic. So in terms of building capacity and community language, how the images we chose, how we promoted this event, back in 2010, was very considered. So the first thing that people were invited to do was to just come and make a place for themselves in their picnic and to bring their dead or the images or the orders of service or however they wanted to. And these objects were things that were brought to the picnic, placed on people's individual picnic rugs and taken home with them. So you saw some of the early images. People brought photographs, they made cakes. The Mexican artist made a traditional Day of the Dead shrine. The beautiful ice sculptures were made by an artist who had lost 7 people in her life in the preceding 2 years, and each one represented one of the people. So the idea is just, how do we travel with the rawness of our loss and hold space and be held in community? So these are just some of the images. And you can see from the faces of some of these people that people were in very raw grief. A lot of the people that came to the picnic, and the reason that the picnic worked and was a safe space, was that I myself had been for the previous sort of decade the celebrant or one of the key people involved in a lot of the actual funeral rites. So there was a core group of people that had already, in which trust was already established. But then once the event was publicized, it took off and we had hundreds of people. The images you've just seen were from the first picnic in 2010. So one of the communal ways in which we invited people to build a community of their dead was to offer something to the collective memory tree. And that was what you saw around the trunks of the trees, and then those beautiful silk sails that were made by a local artist who lived in the area. And she came and picked up the fallen flora and fauna. And as a textile artist with silk, she dyed into those beautiful sails that had little pockets in them and places to peg things on, you know, the local flora and fauna. So this is the sort of end of the picnic, the beautiful sails. And then people would, I didn't include too many photographs of the really laden memory trees with people's photographs, but by the end of the picnic, these trees were, the boughs of the trees were full of photos, of orders of service, of notes, of things that people made that sort of reflected their dead, and around which the ceremony happened. So these two memory trees sit in the middle of this sort of circular park, and it forms a very natural ceremonial space. The second offering was the passing it on tree. And passing it on, as we often know, is a euphemism for dying and dead and an easier language, but it is the inherent essence of the rite of passage. What is it that we pass on when we die to our people? What are our legacies and how do we hand them over? And this for me has always been one of the very important parts of reintegrating our dying, our after death care into our funeral care, so that this sense of continuity enables us to hand on our legacies or the distilled values of our living to the people that will continue. So it was literally, the question was, what have your dead passed on to you? It may be in the form of a recipe, a way of being, a doing, a hint, a saying. And the idea was that people would write down the things that their dead had passed on, and that they could, if they found something on the passing it on tree that they thought was really useful for them, like a maxim for life, then they could take that. But the passing it on tree also developed a life of its own, where people would write letters and stories and just things that they felt or remembered or wanted to say to their people. So, for example, my dad always said to me, never let the sun set on an argument. So in the first picnic, I wrote that out and I put that on the tree, and someone else's grandma had said, always pack your best lipstick. You know, so these things were often very heartfelt, but also very simple maxims that people could take. So this was the passing it on tree. We had literally just yarn with some beautiful, one of the key team members was worked in the opal mines up in Lightning Ridge, and these little washed pebbles that you see come out at they're the sort of detritus at the end of the opal mining process. So this is what we made. This is Chinese joss paper in which people do write notes to the dead. So this is the sort of use of it. And it really became a really powerful part of the picnic for people. At the picnic, we always had a central ceremony with a welcome to country, a choir. I would hold ceremony and really just speak to, and in the way of responding to who came, who the picnickers were, but also with a real mind to thinking about what is the everyday language that we can furnish ourselves and each other with to reintegrate death as a part of life. And how do we work intergenerationally, and how do we make it safe? And really the idea of a picnic, which is a great equalizer. We're literally on the ground. People bring their picnics, they lay out their picnic rugs, people's picnics join. There's enough space if you're in deep grief, and we definitely had picnics where people were really in tears, and picnics where people had taken the time leading up to the picnic to research their ancestors that they might never have met, and they just started to feel a lineage connection. So that the ceremony and the language used was very generative, and the sense of the live voice in the space and the choir you saw at the beginning. My daughter was in that choir. She was little then, and so that was the kids' choir from her local primary school. So I really did a lot of community work to build trust. The adults in that were a mummy's choir that I was in at the primary school, and another local choir called Nothing Without Belinda. And Nothing Without Belinda and members of the Warren choir sang for 10 years as the picnic developed its own life. So the first picnic, we had an Indigenous elder welcome us, and we had a sort of local opera singer just really do some beautiful toning at the beginning before the ceremony. That's me there, and that's the sort of very informal ceremonial gathering in this beautiful space. People just sort of hanging around. And that's one of the years of the choir. I don't have any images of the meandering mandalas, but what they were was what Jessie was referring to, which was all these things that various team members collected from the ground as pods fell or seeds fell. We had a few beachcombers in our original team. So all of the little moments of organic materials arrived, and they were available in little containers, and they really caught the imagination of the kids. There was a lot of kids that came to these picnics, and in fact, many children who grew up in this picnic coming every year for a decade. And the meandering, so this was the first picnic. The kids' space really evolved up into, not so much cut and paste. But we found when I was talking to a lot of the primary school kids who were going to sing in the first picnic, their first experience of loss was a pet. And so we just worked very easily and gently with what was available to them in terms of what they understood and how they could begin to develop their own death literacy. And I won't play it because I'm already running out of time. But underneath this image is a really beautiful text piece, which I'm happy to send anyone, which was a recording of a young dad who I worked with when his 32-year-old wife died of lung cancer, and they had an 18-month-old, or maybe just on 2. And I gave language to this dad to give to his just emerging into language daughter. That became this incredible grounding foundation for them over the years, for her to be able to hold a connection of where her mother was. So I'm not going to play that in this. I'll just keep going. So this is the memory tree, and I just want to play again. I played you something from the first picnic. This is some footage from the last one, which we held in Sydney in 2019. The project was funded by council for a number of years, and then we put it on in a voluntary capacity from 2010 to 2019. It was always a 10-year project, the idea of which was then to seed it through broader communities, because we'd road tested the ideas, the methodology, the grief theories that informed each of the installations and elements, and we'd had 10 years of experience. And of course, 2020 was a big year for the world. Everything changed, COVID came, and we weren't able to really move so much on the seeding of this picnic, even though we now have a little website called picnicamongfriends.org that's got a whole lot of resources if you'd like to do one in your community. It's open source. And just this year, I'm going to seed the picnic as part of a community arts festival up in the Central Western District of New South Wales called Candos. So I just wanted to play a little this again, and then I'll quickly move through other things and we can discuss. And there's lots of dogs too.
This community memorial picnic among friends aimed to use creativity as a way of creating a new aesthetics of remembrance, new ways to gather, new ways to support us, to work intergenerationally, to create what we call death literacy in our kids by creating a dynamic, beautiful, safe space for all of us to come together and remember in. To undo the isolation and individualization that so often characterizes the experience we have when we lose people we love. These picnics, full of our living and our dead, remind us that the ties that bind us endure, not just through time, but through that incredible, mysterious veil that separates the living and the dead. And that whilst we take a first breath and we take a last breath, we are always connected.
So I'm not going to play this one because this just speaks to, it just has some very lovely language that picnickers started to feed back as to what these picnics meant for them. So I know that we're short on time. So yeah, I want you just to sit with that picnic, and I'd love to take some questions, but I'm going to now in the next couple of minutes, just move through, and these are just images, the dusk ceremony at the Elephant House in the old Anglican section at Rookwood Necropolis. And again, this was a fantastic initiative by Rookwood, who run also an arts exhibition called Hidden, to engage their diverse and local communities in a creative, participatory event to be able to bring people back into the garden cemetery of Rookwood and to make it a safe place for people to gather in. So on the winter solstice, we were invited to hold a dusk ceremony in one of the original rest houses of Rookwood, a very beautiful, it's called the Elephant House because of the Raj-inspired architecture. And it's in one of the closed, as in no new burials, beautiful old sections. So the idea being at the winter solstice was that we were going to play with the falling of the light into the darkness, and community were invited to come to the Serpentine Canal to make a lantern and then to travel in a procession to one entrance of the little rest house. And inside the rest house, they could light a candle, light some incense, think about people that they love that had died, or just be in this experience of what it means to be a little bit in between the worlds. Then they would come out the other side of the Elephant House to an enormous fire. I don't know how they let us do a massive bonfire like that, but we did. And there was tea and food, and people just gathered and hung out in the nighttime in this incredible place. So I'll just quickly show you some images of that. And of course, there was a ceremony. Now, the ceremony in these participatory community events where people are just doing what they're doing, they're making their lanterns. The ceremony is the guiding language that builds the context for how people can be. And people, again, would come and they would have people buried at Rookwood, or they would come because they were in early grief or early loss, or they would come out of curiosity, or they would come because it was a great event for their kids. So people came with a variety of intentions and drivers. And the ceremonial language was always around giving people, through their senses, a way in which they would absorb what made sense to them. And be able to find the language to speak about this event and what it meant. And I found in all of the ceremonial events and performance events I have done that are around death, loss, grief, people are hungry for it. There's always a massive turnout. So we don't have a photo here because the Indigenous elder who welcomed us to country has died. He was a deep friend of myself and us at Life Rights, but there was a welcome here. Here I am chatting. People are making their lanterns. Here we are walking to the back of the elephant house. Again, one of the ways in which we engage creative, aesthetic, artistic practice is to just incidentally have objects, all of natural materials, just in and around and through the landscape. And of course, music. Sound is a really important thing. So we had a beautiful cellist playing as we processed. Here is the beautiful elephant house. We're coming up the back of it now. You can see that we used the veils, the sails, which became a veil, into the elephant house. This is what it looked like inside. Very simple elemental ways in which people could engage. The people that are singing at this doorway were members of the Threshold Choir who literally sang to people as they were dying. So they were a choir. I don't know if they still operate in Sydney, but in the mid-2000s and 2010s, they were a beautiful bunch of women and very active, and they often worked on this event with us. So everybody comes into the elephant house. The incense is going. So we've got these very elemental, these elements that reflect the water, the earth, the air, the fire, these very real grounding senses of what it means to arrive into life on life's terms. And again, people put their hands in the dirt, they put their hands in the water, they lit incense. And it was really just a very simple way of people gathering to remember their people, to be part of community. And we stayed in there as there was a ceremony happening and as the light fell. And everybody lit their lanterns. And there was always music. So this woman is a beautiful shakuhachi flute player. So that sense of holding people in these ceremonial, performative, community, beautiful, safe, liminal spaces, using creative practice, sound, images, inviting people to participate in a way that makes them feel safe and part of it so that they can drop into their feelings, but they're held by the communal body, is really the sort of dramaturgical and methodological principle for me of these works. And then people emerged from whatever and however much time they wanted to spend in the elephant house to the other side, right on dusk. And that people went back and forth, in and out. They emerged to tea and drumming and a huge fire and marshmallows, and the space was beautifully lit, and the kids just went wild. They loved it, you know, and it was so beautiful because you could have been anywhere. We were in this safe city of the dead, and it was like the dead were so happy we were all there. It was just the safest, most comfortable space. I won't play this. This just gives you an idea of the panorama, but I know we're also running out of time. So following on from those two events, which, you know, spanned some time, after the fires, we just dropped in again to a ceremony that honored what we'd lost, our wildlife, the flora, the fauna, as well as the loss of people's life and the loss of people's homes. And I don't have a lot of images of this. It was just the flyer, But again, I just included this because by this point, we're in 2020, Life Rights was really becoming the focus of my practice, and the Living with Our Dead community organization was sitting side by side with us, stepping in with premises and a fuller team and a bigger sort of mantle of really starting to offer holistic end of life after death care funeral services. And so what I just want to finish on now, I'll be very quick, are some of the cultural, artistic and community projects that wrap around our core Life Rights work. And one of these was Grief Works, which is a night of short works that were created by people who had come to Life Rights as their funeral directors, but who also had an artistic or creative practice in their lives. And they were then asked to reflect upon their experience of their funeral rite or their loss or their grief or their bereavement as artists. And we were given a development funding by a small organization, and we basically got all the artists together for a week and we put on a showing. So there was 5 different artists. 1 made a film, 2 made sound pieces, 1 made a durational piece, 2 made sort of short works that people watched. Everybody came into this space and all of the works were sort of scattered around the space. And it was a very powerful place for people to gather. It was very powerful because it really started to engage with the form of contemporary theatre, but also undo that form at the same time. Auntie Rhonda Dixon Grosvenor opened and welcomed, and everybody was smoked before they went in. So this duty of care is important. So it was really about what is your aesthetic and creative response to loss and bereavement and grief? And how do we express grief through lived sensory experience? So these people on the ground on the right were honouring they were sort of experimental improvisational musicians, and one of their core members had died that we'd looked after, and they did a beautiful opening sound piece. The person on my left, we had just buried his father, and he was engaging with unpacking all of as an executor and next of kin. And so he had this durational piece where he just was going through the films, the photographs, the paperwork of his dad. This person, her father, she lived with she cared for her father who lived with chronic illness and mental distress, and whose best friend and safest person in his life was his huge dog, who and this was her, what would we say? Her inheritance from him was the remains of his dog. And she did a piece called Dog Man that was very powerful about living with and caring for her father. And then the night sort of ended with people up, talking, dancing, just really being together and being able to drop into a sort of shared communal space of grief and love and loss. Very quickly, we run a Friday night film night program at the funeral home. We curate 4 films a year that have death and grief and loss and life and love themes, and we have popcorn, and it's a safe space, and people come and watch a film with us, and they're always really great, interesting experiences. Dying to Know Day, we open our funeral home every year. We invite people into spaces in our funeral home that have previously been kept off limits to them in terms of transparency, and people getting a fuller lived experience picture of where they might go when they die, or where do their people go. So this is Vicky and Sarah talking through how we give very deep, powerful mortuary care. And the final thing I want to show quickly is we looked after a very powerful member of our community, and when she died, her desire was that we all fully dressed up. And so everybody in her memorial, Sarah and I, had on these sparkly kaftans, and we were holding the space, and one of our community members dubbed us the Cosmic Nuns. And in a way that just we then sort of began to be invited to open performance events. Most recently on Friday night, we opened, so Auntie Rhonda, Sarah and myself, we opened a World Overdose Awareness Day storytelling event that a community organisation, ACON, ran. We've been invited by contemporary art organisations to perform the art gallery, Carriage Works. And this is really, I won't go into it much now, I'll just show some images, but this is very powerful work because we're entering back, or I and Sarah and Auntie Rhonda are entering back into the frame of the arts with a 20-year ceremonial practice and meeting inside these frames with deep care and deep respect. And a lot of the people that are coming to know the Cosmic Nuns also know that we have looked after members of the community as their funeral directors. So we're sort of slowly dismantling these siloed spaces where death happens and life happens and art happens and creativity happens, and weaving them back together. And with the ceremony, with the Cosmic Nuns, we do it with a bit of glitz and a bit of campery and a bit of fabulousness. So this is us in the most recent event on Friday night at the Red Rattler. This is Auntie Rhonda Dixon Grosvenor in her possum cloak. Sarah and I as Cosmic Nuns. We were speaking to what it means to, you know, for us to hold our people in overdose space. And that's the end. And then the stories went on. The people that were invited to share a spoken word piece. So thank you for listening to that 40 minutes of high-speed conversation. I'd love to hear whatever you may have to feedback. And yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Victoria. A picture tells 1,000 words. I'm so grateful that you've got this amazing collection of imagery, and grateful to the people in those photos, knowing that, you know, their collective effort gets amplified. So thank you. Take a breath, sit back, relax. We'll do the work now. Thank you, Victoria. Just really opening it up. There's I'm going to throw to Julianne, who's got a question, and then we've got another one that I'll relay after that. Julianne, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Vic, for that incredible sharing. I really fascinated in the use of participatory arts as a medium for supporting people to live well, but also deal with our death and supporting each other. What difference do you feel in your experience by actually having people actively involved in the creation of art makes in terms of their ability to be able to process and move through those emotions and come to a space maybe of acceptance, or to me, it's often a more gentle, potentially a gentle process if done well, if it's held in a good space. And I'm just curious about your experience, because often when we think about arts, it can be perceived as something that we are the observer and the artist does. And yet many of the things that you presented there was, for my mind, were the artist creating a space, holding space, but everyone else was involved in that process.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, one thing I didn't say at the beginning was before I came into working ceremonially, I'd spent 15 years in experimental creative performance practice. And most of that was dismantling what we call the fourth wall between the audience and the performer. So I have long been a passionate advocate for how we all arrive in our bodies, in space, in time and place, and how we meet in real equitable ways. So just as I'm passionate and committed to build equitable death and funeral rights, before that, I was all around how do we all have access to creativity, and it's not the province of anyone that went to art school or someone that identifies as an artist, but that these practices are inherent to all of us. So I think one of the ways in which how it's facilitated and how the invitation is worded and offered and the context that's built around what you want to invite people into is the key. And I think understanding that there needs to be different ways in which people can engage, because some people have different ways of processing in the world, and some people are quite comfortable being visible and some people aren't. So for me, being able to engage people in a fully embodied way by being the person that is highly visible to say, I will do the heavy lifting for you. I will hold this. I will build the foundation. I will pave the road, and continue to listen deeply to you to build the context. And, you know, so for example, with the picnic, that emerged organically out of years of conversation about what people weren't getting and what they felt they didn't have available to them. And it really, I don't know about how other people generate work, but sometimes things just come to me. Like, I just thought one day, as I was deep in building the picnic in the residency in 2010, how much I would have loved to have had a picnic with a few key thinkers that I really shaped my life. And then I thought, a picnic among friends, what a great way, what a soft, gentle invitation for people. So I think how we create the opportunity for participation firstly has to come through really deep listening to what is available and what isn't, and what people feel that they might want to do. And often you only know what you can do from what people articulate that isn't available to them. So I think for me, understanding equity, understanding how to activate space, how to put enough in it so that people can orient themselves in the picnic, in a theatre space, in a workshop, but have enough ways in which they can enter on their terms. That's the facilitation skill, I feel. So not being too overly prescriptive, or not saying to people, oh, well, see that empty space over there, off you go, because that's like a blank page. That's terrifying. So knowing how much to inhabit and how much to offer, and then being inherently flexible. That's how I undertake my generative, creative, participatory processes. And then at a certain point, when we're going into performance, I might get a bit bossy about how to cue things and transition things. So often for people on the night, I came into this work in ceremony and in funeral land because I knew that there wasn't enough connective tissue in the transitions for people through their lives. And in my theatre work, I understand that meaning is made in the transitions of theatre, how people enter and leave the stage, what the lights do, what the sounds do. You can't, to speak plainly, you can't fuck up the cues. And if you do, then all of the delicate meaning and all the safety and all the things you're creating, all the threads, they also disappear. So holding people in transitions, how they enter, how they leave, how they first enter, how they navigate through, that's the key, I believe, to very successful and powerful participatory, creative, embodied, sensory experiences.
Vic, I'm going to read a question out and then we'll go to Joe. I can see the hands up there. How did the organisers or the community undo what was created in the picnic space? So, for example, that memory tree, the passing it on tree. Was there a ritual or a ceremony of this process? That's from Kip.
Yes, good question, Kip, and I didn't talk to that. So all of the everything that was left on the memory tree, so people took all of the flowers that we put there, and whatever was left on the boughs of the trees and in the silks was ceremoniously, we bumped it in and we bumped it out, and it was a full long day for all of us, and many picnickers would help. Sometimes people would put things on the memory tree or the passing it on tree and take it back with them. But everything that was left was held and lovingly collated and collected by the Living with Our Dead team. And I have a fire in my backyard, and we would sit together and we would burn, bury, transform them, and then we would often go back to Girraween Park and release those ashes in and around the trees and in the spaces. I have a river at the bottom of my garden, and some of the things were sort of sent down the river, you know, things that were okay to go in the river. So there was much care taken. You know, occasionally all of the picnic kit, which is vast, grew to be a vast kit. I've just sort of about to redo the picnic again after a few years, and I have found a couple of things that fell, you know, got packed up elsewhere. So I've got, as we speak, a little stash of offerings to transform. So understanding the elements and transforming them and releasing them and saging our team members and really looking after ourselves is a big part of this work. So good question, Kip. Thank you.
Jo, do you want to unmute and pop on in?
Hi, Victoria. I just wanted to thank you with your rich presentation today, but also talking about art rituals and the incredible way that you curate and design them. I think it's really beautiful. My question's a little bit dry. It's about funding. I know you touched on the fact that you had some local city council funding, but I make kind of large scale art rituals in Melbourne about loss, grief and loneliness. And I find funding so tricky because arts boards are very reluctant to know where to put you in terms of art rituals and where you found the most success.
Yeah, look, so the picnic was funded in 2010, as I said, by the Australia Council Residency. The picnic was then funded for 2 or 3 years with a short community council grant, and then we just did it voluntarily for the rest. GriefWorks was funded by Brand X, which is a sort of group of studios, artists run studios up here, and they gave us a very small amount of money. I'm about to head back into art funding land for Create New South Wales for a podcast and other things. But to be honest, Jo, my mission, I do a lot of this. And so the Rookwood work was paid for by Rookwood Cemetery Trust. So I think one of the ways I would suggest for you is to build relationships with your, you know, with local funeral directors or cemeteries or crematoria, and find out where they are in your local area and just see if they have creative projects and programs, and to put a work into Hidden up in Sydney, you know, and start to build that portfolio, because I don't know how it is in Melbourne, but in Sydney there is a little bit now, a little bit more slippage between, oh, we're working outside the frame of the arts. But my mission, really understanding how bereft and limited arts funding is, I set up Life Rights, Holistic Integrated Funeral Directors, to try and generate, you know, an ethical business, but for that little machine to also be able to fund some of the community and cultural programs that surround it. Now, we haven't quite got to that yet, so I'm still saying that to work as a creative citizen in Sydney and Australia, you really often are on your own personal time and labour, and I really understand that that's not sustainable. You know, me going to redo the picnic or to offer the picnic is funded a little bit by this community festival called Cementa in Kandos. So I think it is just about partnerships, and I wish I could find a way to, I wish I could say to you, oh, the arts funding really understands community work now in highly aesthetic, evolved, sophisticated, participatory work as part of its mantle. But we can have an off-camera chat about that, eh?
Thanks, Vic. We've just got about 2 or 3 minutes left if anybody wants to share. Just while you're thinking about that, just a reminder, we'll send out the recording, we'll send out the links to Vic's work, and we're going to...
Teamwork. There's Sarah Barry's here, and Vicky Melson is here, and Kim's here, and it's a lot of our team. So, you know, the cultural and community programs that run alongside Life Rights are really a collective effort now. And I'm very hopeful that as the business of Life Rights kicks along in our core practice, that I have a bit more time now to build the next level of cultural and community practice alongside and around Life Rights and back out into the community.
Beautiful. Thanks, Victoria. You're getting lots of thanks in the chat, so we're going to wrap it up there. Victoria, I hope you are going to go and do something very nice for yourself now, like eat lunch.
Oh, yeah, this was pretty nice, though. I have to say thank you, everyone. I'm very touched and moved and honoured that you've given up your hour to listen to this. And if any of you feel in this Compassionate Communities context that the Picnic Among Friends might be something you want to seed in your community, in your local area, in your park, then that is an entirely open source project. www.picnicamongfriends.org. It's a little website, it's up there, and I'm really wanting to reinvigorate my relationship to that, and to see whether there might be something there that's appropriate or interesting to any of you. Reach out, send me an email, make contact, take what you like, leave the rest. It's all there.
Beautifully said. So thank you to Compassionate Communities Australia for curating this webinar, and go well. Lots of love.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Everyone.